Welcome back to our second tutorial, which looks at employing variable arrays within our session 2 of our C++ series. I recommend that if you haven't seen session 1, which looks at creating variables, that you kind of go back and have a look at that before we start building on our foundation. Let's have a look at the two learning objectives set for this session. The first one looks at understanding the use of variable arrays. Second one looks at understanding the C++ memory banks and how variables are stored within the memory allocation table. Now in session number 1 we looked at creating different data types or using different data types for different reasons within our program. For example, int was to hold a whole number, float was allocated to hold a decimal number with up to 6 decimal points. And what a variable array is very similar to that, but all you have to visually remember, if I draw it up below for you to have a look at, is basically a string of boxes which have the same purpose or the same characteristics to hold or store information or store data in this sense. What you need to remember out of that slide is that when we start counting our boxes, that the data is stored at the starting point of 0. So in mathematical terms, 0 is a number. We might associate 0 as being nothing, but in mathematical terms or in programming terms, 0 has an allocation, which is basically the number 0. So when we start using our arrays, it's very important that we incorporate that number 0 itself as well. We look at square brackets, but I want to show that to you a bit later on within the session. Let's have a look at an example. As you can see, there's an example which looks at int nums and square brackets 6. So that basically means that we are going to create a box. Let's draw it up. Something like that. And which is characteristics of int. That means it's only going to be holding whole numbers. The name of the array is nums. And the maximum set of information or boxes we can create is 6. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Good. And when we create our session itself, as I mentioned to you the session before, or the slide before, we cannot start with 1. The problem here occurs that 0 does exist, but we're not using it in the count table. So that's going to give you an error message itself. So it's very important that we start counting from 0. So we have created our 6 tables, but whatever we put in, these are 6 allocations itself. But when we store anything in that session up here, you have to refer to 0. So we will have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, which a total of 6 boxes, including the 0. So 0 to 5 would be your 6 boxes. And I've got an example up here. That's how it's drawn up. So let's have a look at the next slide, where we kind of use an array to store something else. So we looked at an example just now where we can store numbers, in our case int, which is whole numbers. And in our example up here on this slide, we can refer to it as storing char. So storing char, if you remember right from session number 1, looks at storing single bytes or single bits, including one character. So any character you can think of can be stored in one of these char boxes. In our case, we have created a name, which is in this case is Mike, and we have got a weird kind of a character which is up here, which is a special character to obviously store the string itself. So if we draw it up in our visual representation, 3, 5, yep, that will be a char. So that means it can hold one character in each box, and this array is called name, and we have 5 boxes in there, which we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Obviously start with the allocation number 0, and we put in the characters such as that, and obviously that's your special character itself. Let's have a look at a slightly different example. So when we create our arrays, we can obviously create one array to store a name or different characters or different kind of numbers itself. But we can create something called multiple dimensional array or multi-dimensional array. And basically how that looks at is creating two sets of arrays. So the session up here, when you look at the example, what this one talks about is the number of arrays. So if we draw it up like that, how about three boxes, we draw a line between them, that's our two arrays created. So the first number associates to how many boxes, which is 1 and 2, and the second one looks at how many boxes are we creating, how many memory allocations we're creating. So what we're creating up here is something which looks something like that. And why we would want to do that is store obviously different data within a multiple dimensional array. And there's different reasons for it. There's three-dimensional arrays as well, which we're going to look at hopefully at the later on, close to end of this series of C++ tutorials, where we're going to look at creating a game where we're going to have our three-dimensional arrays to store three-dimensional data. But in this session, all you need to know is that three-dimensional arrays do exist, and we're going to look at two-dimensional arrays with an example later on in this PowerPoint. So let's have a look at the program. So we started off with looking at creating variables in session number 1, and we obviously went through a program as well. And what we're looking at today is creating, obviously building on that knowledge and creating your array boxes. So let's start. So the first include statement is a library itself. Using namesets standard, we're going to look at that a bit later on. Int main starts your program, two brackets, one curly bracket to start the program off, and then we have our first box. So if I can draw it up a bit here, a bit more space here, and what we're creating up here is something like that, and this itself is created, and then these sections up here are start populating this array itself. So this big array, or the three slots within that, have a characteristics of float. It means it can hold a decimal point up to 6, well, a decimal number up to 6 decimal points. And this array is called nums. And the maximum we have is 3. So if you look at this example up here, it looks at num0. So that means location number 0, which is this. That's location number 1. That's location number 2. So when you look at that, from 0 to 2 is actually 3 numbers, 3 boxes. And the first one, we put in the value 1.5. Second one, as you can have a look up here, is 2.75. And the third one looks at 3.25. And that's all done. So when we created our array, we can create the array and then start populating it, or in the example below, which is the chart with the name associated to it, we can create an array and populate it at the same line itself. But it's your choice. There's two different ways of doing it. So if we draw up the second one as well, which is the same one which we looked at slightly earlier, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yep. And this one is a char. It means each box within that array can hold one character, and it's called name, and it's a total of 5. So we have from 0 to 4. So there's 0, that's 1, that's 2, that's 3, and that's 4. So from 0 to 4 would be 5 boxes itself. And we put in the first one, M, I, K, E, and obviously then we have our special character. The second one looks at creating coordinates. So that means we have a two-dimensional array. So it's basically the same concept. It's just got one more layer to it. How many do we have? 3, right? So portion is not that well, not well structured, but you kind of make sense out of it. And this one is an int, which means it can hold a whole number. And this array, two-dimensional array, is called codes. Look at that, coordinates, if you want to have a look at that. And we have a total. So the first number looks at how many arrays we create. 1 and 2, perfect. And the second number in the square brackets looks at how many values are we putting into it. So we've got a total of 3 boxes, and the first set of data within the curly brackets looks at the first array itself, and then we put in 1, 2, and 3. The second one looks at 4, 5, and 6. Perfect. So this one is just be done as well. So we have created our boxes, or we created our variables and populated it with data. So let's have a look at the CRs, which are shout out messages, and let's see what data we get out. So this one itself is just data, or just a message. It doesn't actually do anything. Anything in quotation marks doesn't do anything. But this is the variable name, or the location itself. So this one looks at nums 0. So if you remember, the first array we created was nums, and looks at location number 0, which the output is 1.5. On the next slide, we're going to have all the answers. So just let's do it first as a dry run, and then we look at the results a bit later on. The second one looks at nums 1. So location number 1 was this one up here, and that's 2.75. Third one obviously looks at nums 2. So that's 3.25. That's what the answer should be. And the next one looks at the name and location number 0. So we created another array which was called Mike, or was holding the characteristics of Mike, and location number 0 looks at an M. The answer for that is just an M, because we're just looking at the location number, which is 0. The next one is something different. It doesn't have any location number to it, just got the name of the array. So if we don't have any square brackets with any numbers in there, and it just says the name of the array itself, well, the output would be the whole concept of the array. In this case, it's Mike, because it's not asking for any specific boxes, it's asking for the whole array name itself. The second one looks at coordinates, so that's the double or two-dimensional array we just created below that, which is this one here. Draw a small cross next to it. And the first shout out message looks at array number 0 and location number 2. So when we look at that, array number 0, it always comes from 0 itself, is this one up here. So if I draw a line, hopefully you can see that, which is number 0, and it looks at coordinates number 2. So 0, 1, and 2, and the answer should be 3. Draw a 3 up here. And the second one looks at coordinates, which is array number 1, which looks at that, and location or memory allocation number 2, which in this case is exactly the same, 0, 1, and 2, and the answer should be 6. And obviously then we have our return 0, which is obviously stops the program itself. So if you go on to the next slide, we should be able to see all the answers itself. Let's have a look. So we've got, I've run the program previously in a different compiler, so we don't have to run it on this tutorial itself. And what I've run is basically the same program we've just done as a dry run, and these things at the bottom are your answers. So as you can see, the first one was 1.5, then we looked at 2.75, 3.25, so which are all these numbers here. I should circle up on the program for you, which were the 3 nums elements to it. The next one looked at name, so that one was based on Mike, and it looks at location number 0, which was the M itself. The next one, as we talked about, was the whole name of the array, so we don't ask for any specific boxes or any specific locations, so it will give you an answer of Mike itself, so the whole array gets outputted. And then we have our 2 coordinates, so we have our two-dimensional array up here, and it talks about location number 2s for each of them, and the first one talks about array number 0, and the other one talks about array number 1. And we had previously 3 and 6, which, as you can see up here, we got up here as well. We got a few tips on the side, which I'll just tick next to it, which you can have a look at. And it's always handy to have these tips on the side written up somewhere, as sometimes we'll go into much more complex programming, problem solving kind of situations, where these tips sometimes give you more guidance on what you're supposed to do. But I hope you enjoyed your tutorial for creating variable arrays, and if you have any questions, drop me a message or a comment below. I'll have a look at that, and I hope I see you back for session number 3. Take care. Thanks.